All right. So I'm sitting here with Wayne Topping, and I'm so happy to have you joining me today from the UK. We met the first time, I don't know if you remember, but the first time we met was in 2015, I believe, at the IKC conference in Banff. And I remember that we were standing at the buffet in the morning to get breakfast, and this gentleman beside me looked over and saw my name tag and said, "Oh, you're Alexis. I enjoyed your conference journal paper." And I looked over and realized who you were, and my heart skipped a beat. I was like, Wayne Topping went to my conference paper. It was just such a wonderful thing. Because I had never presented at a conference like that before, and it was super exciting.
Very good. I'm glad I made your day.
You totally made my day. So it's been wonderful to be able to spend time with you in the years since then and get to know you and your wife a little better. And today I was hoping that we could spend a little bit of time talking about the immune system, which I know is a subject close to your heart. So I was hoping that in order to start this off, we could just talk a little bit about how the emotions affect the immune system.
Right. Well, in general, we know that when you have any negative emotion you're experiencing, it tends to shut down the frontal part of the brain. We go back into the limbic system and react. That's for negative emotions in general. And we get a non-specific response in the body, such as blood is pulled away from the skin, it's pulled away from the extremities, all those changes as the body is preparing itself for fight-flight response. But most people don't recognize what's happening with the immune system. Many years ago, decades ago, I read a book by John Diamond. You've probably read it, Your Body Doesn't Lie. Do you remember that? And one of the things that impressed me was the fact that he showed the thymus could shrink by up to 50% within size and weight within just 24 hours as a result of stress. And I'm wondering, wow, why would that be? Wouldn't you want the immune system to be strong under those circumstances? Well, there's only a certain amount of energy that the body has. There's only a certain amount of blood available, and certain things get top priority under those fight or flight or emergency circumstances, which is big skeletal muscles, heart and lungs, the vital organs, so we can run out of harm's way or fight off the aggressor, that type of thing. But the immune system takes a lot of energy. It can be shut down temporarily if it's a true emergency. And that's fine, but these days we don't have a true emergency. We have a chronic, ongoing, unfolding pandemic. So there's a lot of stress because you look at newspapers, TV, social media, those sort of things attract our attention with negative stories, negative headlines. So people are being stressed out of their gourds all the time, and that's having a chronic, debilitating effect on the system, particularly the immune system. At the very time, we need to be strong.
Right. Well, it seems extremely unlikely that we would be able to start working with people in hospitals and in retirement homes and that sort of thing, holding their ESRs as we would generally do for sort of general emotional stress and bringing that down into balance. So how do we help those people then? What is the advice for the people that are sort of isolated right now?
Yeah, well, that's true, because, for example, I saw the problem when I was teaching in Russia. I gave a lecture to a large group of over 300 teachers, and a lot of them had been exposed to brain gym, and they're really excited because they can see here are some relatively simple exercises. They could bring about significant change within young bodies and brains to prepare them for that learning environment. But the frustration was they couldn't sell the administration on why this was so important. And I imagine the administrators are thinking, how on earth am I going to explain these strange exercises to parents? And rather than allowing what could be used for the benefit of the students, they shut it down. So I saw their frustration. So I realized, yeah, there's no way the government's going to allow us, a lot of kinesiologists, to run around old folks' homes teaching the stress release, because it's weird, it's not part of the medical model. So what can we do? We have to start taking a different approach, looking at how we can help them. And one of the things that comes to mind is a study I remember reading about in the United States, where they had an old folks home, and as an experiment, they divide the old folks into two groups. One group was given an assignment, and the other group was not. And what they found at the end of the study, the group that was given the assignment only had 1/3 the illnesses, 1/3 the sickness of the other group, 1/3 the deaths, 1/3 the illnesses. And so you're thinking, well, that must be a pretty powerful assignment. No, it wasn't actually. They were just told it's your responsibility to water the plants. That's all. And that drastically decreased both illness and death. Why? Because they had a purpose. And even though it's a small purpose, the point is, as people get older, they don't need much of a purpose in order to stay alive and be a lot healthier. So if I was in charge of rest homes, what I would be doing, and of course they probably hasn't occurred to them that they could do this, is figure out what small tasks can we get to do each of these people to do so they can do something that allows them to serve a purpose, so they feel some sense of fulfillment as if they're contributing to the community, and that would greatly strengthen their immune systems. But you're not going to hear all that, because what we have is a modern warfare type approach. It's all cranked up to combat it as if it's a battle, and they're not looking at a lot of the social factors and the research that's available to saying that there are a lot of very simple things could be applied for a lot better benefit.
That's really interesting. I wouldn't think of just something as simple as having to care for a plant as being that kind of strong immune stimulant.
Yeah.
But that's interesting. And then of course you think about how that would also help with your microbiome, and it would, yeah, there's all kinds of great stuff happening there.
Yeah, and the other thing we need to look at is in terms of at this particular time. Well, okay, let's go on to the next question.
Well, I was just going to follow up from that, because I mean, it's not just people in retirement homes that are feeling alone and purposeless right now, right? A lot of people are really struggling with isolation. So how do we work with that?
Yeah, well, isolation is a really big factor. And again, another study. I like studies because once you look at a study and get the major lesson, then you learn the principle from it. And I remember reading about a place called Roseto back in the United States. This is about 75 miles north of Philadelphia in the eastern part of the United States. And it was called Roseto because these are Italian immigrants that came across from a place called Roseto in Italy, moved across the States. And so they were typical Italians, you know, laughing, throwing their arms around a lot and drinking and smoking and going to Catholic church on Sunday to ask for forgiveness for what they did during the week. Catholic Italians marrying Italians, 3 generations within the same household, grandparents, parents, kids, that type of thing, and a lot of social groups. And so the typical Italian lifestyle. And you'd think that'd be a good formula, a terrible diet. So you think that would be a great formula for heart disease, but they actually had a very low amount of heart disease. And the authorities couldn't figure it out. The researchers were debating what it was, and they decided, well, it has to be the water. Well, it actually wasn't the water, because this was in the 60s. And what happened over a period of time since then, the Italians started marrying outside their community. So Italians started marrying Swedes, which there should be a law against. It doesn't happen. One is very emotional and the other is very reserved. It's not a good combination. But you had Italians marrying non-Italians. They stopped going to church. They straightened up their diet. A lot of them gave up smoking. They had better diets and that. But suddenly their heart disease rate went up, and until they had the same amount of heart disease as all the surrounding communities. And then they realized it had nothing to do with the water. It was actually the social cohesion. As long as you had Italians living together in the extended family systems they have, going to the same church and all talking the same strange language, and the same social groups, they had that social cohesion which gave them the strength against heart disease. And as soon as that got broken, that social cohesion by becoming Americanized, then they lost their protection against heart disease. And I saw another study, which is really fascinating, where they're doing research on rats, because you can't do this sort of research very well on humans, and they want to deliberately induce a plaque buildup within the arteries. So they're feeding these rats a terrible diet to clog up the arteries as fast as they can. So they kill the rats, open them up, and look at what the plaque buildup would look like within the arteries as the heart disease was advancing. And it was going great. They had plenty of cadavers to open up. The only thing was, there's one group of rats that just weren't doing what they're supposed to. They weren't dying from heart disease. And they observed and they found out there's a woman in charge of those particular rats, and what she'd do is go stroke the rats and talk sweetly to them and things like that, displaying a lot of tender, loving care to them. And that was following up the experiment because her tender, loving care toward the rats more than compensated for the terrible diet. And so the plaque wasn't building up within those arteries. So that mishap actually showed them that the emotional factors were far more important than the terrible diet that they're on to deliberately induce this heart disease. So if you have a husband that's on a lot of junk food diet, just wait till he's asleep and then just say, I love you, honey, I love you. So it more than compensates for the junk food diet. No, the emotional factors, the social factors, as it turns out, are a lot more powerful than a lot of the things we tend to give most credence to, which would be nutrition and exercise, things like that.
Yeah. You know, we live in a very small village here, and it's a very traditional, there's sort of two different groups of people in this little village that I live in. One is the local Costa Rican community, the Tico community, where you see it's very similar to what you're describing with the Italian community that you were reading the study on. Like the families here, it's very typical that when your children grow up and they get married, you simply like cut a little chunk of your property off for them and build them a little house over here. And everybody kind of intermingles. And, you know, there's basically 3 families that own this village, and everybody is close to all of their family, and all the kids are together all the time. And then you have the expats here, who are mostly people who have moved here from Canada, the US, Europe, as one little family, right? Or one person, even worse. And they don't have that same kind of community. The expats that are here tend to be here because they are looking for a more self-sustainable, healthy lifestyle. So we all eat really well, we all work out, we all do all of those things, right? The Ticos eat a diet in this area that a lot of people would consider to be very much junk food. But they have the family network and the community support, and they're so happy. And it is absolutely a joy to spend time with my neighbors and their families because they have that, right? And they're not getting sick, you know, and they're not concerned right now about what's going on in the rest of the world because they have their own tight little community here.
So what you're talking about is the benefits of the tight community, but under pandemic conditions, that's been totally disrupted. I'm not sure about over there, but here, the old folks are stuck away, can't the grandkids, because the grandkids might carry the virus and infect them and kill off the old folks. So a lot of the old folks haven't mixed with their grandkids for, we're talking about maybe 5 or 6 months. They're by themselves. And one of the worst things you can have when you become older is loneliness and isolation. It's a disastrous combination.
Right. Okay. So kind of taking this into a slightly different place then for a moment. One of the things that we're really encouraged to do when we are working with a system like Touch for Health or a lot of other kinesiology modalities, we're encouraged to not just do balances, but to do balances with specific goals. And I'm thinking about this also in relation to what you just said about how having a task and having some kind of focus seems to help your immune system. Do you have any thoughts about why it's so important to be setting goals, or how we can set goals that are going to help support us through this time?
Yes, well, they did a study. This is called the Body Age Study that was done in the 1980s up in Canada by the Canadian Institute of Stress. Because they wanted to find out what was most effective. There, they weren't talking about decreasing stress. They actually wanted to reverse the biological clock. So they had over 600 different volunteers, and what they did, they knew their chronological age. They wanted to find out their biological age or body age. Now, how do you determine that? Well, they looked at blood pressure, they looked at resting heart rate, skin elasticity, they dropped something and see how quickly you could catch it, those sorts of things. And they looked at number of wrinkles, length of the wrinkles, depth of the wrinkles, dark circles under the eyes, all those factors, get some sort of measure of biological age. Then what they did is put them into 5 different groups. One group, they assigned to nutrition, so really healthy nutrition. Another group, relaxation. Another group, exercise. Another group, self-affirming communication, and the final group, values and goals. And they ran this study for 8 months, and there were 602 people finished this particular study. Then they looked at the results. And most of these people started out over 10 years older from a biological perspective than the chronological age. So they were really out of shape. And most of them finished up 8 years younger than their chronological age within 8 months. And what do you think is most important? Well, most people, when asked that question, they say, well, exercise. And some say, no, it's nutrition. No, it wasn't actually. Values and goals was the most powerful intervention. So that's why goal setting is so important. And then I've been looking at over the years, why is goal setting so powerful? And I think because it's linked to, it gives you more control and more commitment to life. So, for example, I teach a class called Overcoming Adversity. And one of the things we looked at is research that was done by Dr. Salvador Mardi and Suzanne Cabasa. They were looking at a large company in the United States, the government considered to be a monopoly, and they said, this is bad, we can't have a monopoly, you have to cut yourself up. So this large company, 26,000 employees, cut themselves down to 14,000 employees and end up as 6 smaller companies. Well, that's pretty horrendous when you have to lay off half the workforce, pretty much. And they looked at the 450 of these middle management and upper level executives, and they wanted to find out, why did some of them get sick, and some had heart attacks, some committed suicide, some died, versus the ones that, seemed to take it in stride. And they were looking at something they called hardiness. And what they found is 3 major characteristics. And one of them was control, the opposite feeling powerless. So if you have perceived control over your circumstances, you're a lot more hardy, less stressed, so less impact on the immune system than if you feel powerless about your circumstances. Another one, commitment. The other one's challenge and threatened, but those two, control and commitment, both ally with goals. Those who set goals, who have direction, mission, purpose in their life, are less buffeted by life's circumstances, have a direction, focus, are more likely to stay on course, and less stressed by something like a coronavirus, for example.
Okay, so you're feeling like it is the reduction in stress that would come with goal setting that would help it to, that would positively affect the immune system?
Well, I remember listening to John Thie once at a conference. And I remember this one because he was, by the end, what he was doing was a fix as you go balance. So nothing sophisticated, didn't use the wheel, didn't use 5 elements. He was just using neurolymphatics, neurovasculars, tracing meridians, whatever was required to balance out the muscle. And he said, even if it took him 60% of the time to define the goal, that was the most valuable part of that session. And I'm thinking, well, of course, if it takes 60% of your time to define the goal, obviously the goal was not very sharply focused in the first place. It had to be nebulous, had to be unfocused in that. And if it took that much time to get clarity on it, once you've got clarity on it, you're probably going to achieve it whether or not you did any balancing, because that's the crux, the most important aspect of the goal balance. That makes sense?
Yeah. I watched Matthew in an instructor trainer's class once doing something similar. He was doing a balance with someone and just kept asking her questions while she was clarifying her goal. Yeah. And sitting there in the class, it was driving me insane because I'm not a patient person by nature. And I was looking at it and going, obviously, this is where she actually needs to go with it. Why don't you just put her there, right? Like, my own impatience was coming up. It was a few years ago. And then I watched him just so gently continue guiding her along as she got there. And when she got there, I swear, it was like every light came on. And I don't think he had to do anything really for the balance, right? Like the balance at that point was so simple because it was like the hard work was already done. Right? Yeah, no, I'm with you.
Well, I find a lot of people, including people close to me, have no goals. Never set goals, never intend to write them down. It's almost like they're afraid to commit themselves. And I'm thinking, and in the United States, we know that only 3 to 5% of people ever write down goals. By the time people retire, 3 to 5% of people are financially independent. That's usually the same people. People haven't figured that one out yet.
Right.
Now, make goals, commit them to paper, establish action plans, work toward them, then you allow things to happen that are far less likely to happen otherwise.
Okay, so you have mentioned, about businesses having to lay people off and about retirement and that sort of thing. And I know that one of the things that is on people's minds right now is economic instability because of, again, world crises and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, somebody who's forced into early retirement, who maybe they're in a spot in their life they weren't expecting to be at this time right now. How do we use these things to help them? Because we know that that's one of those scenarios where the immune system can become compromised, right?
Yes. And even if you look at one of the largest companies in America, I won't mention its name, but they were in the same state I was in for 30 years. By the time the upper executives retired, most of them would be dead within 18 months. So they worked really hard, and my assumption is they probably just kicked back, slept longer, watched TV, things like that, and probably shocked, their neighbors would be shocked and spouses when they died. But the point is, if you don't have structure in your life, if you don't have purpose, something to put your energy into, the body can start shutting down quite quickly. A lot of school teachers are dead within 3 years of retirement. So for someone who's laid off, their immune system, if they don't have the structure in their life, some purpose, something they're working towards, their system can shut down quite easily and then become more vulnerable. So what do you do? If you look at the Chinese word for crisis, it's 2 characters, danger and opportunity. The pandemic is a danger. We all know it. That's why jobs have been cut. Companies are being folded. Everything is in crisis over in England here right now. That's the apparent danger. But every danger is associated with an opportunity. And so when someone gets laid off, they have 2 choices. They can just drink more or smoke cigarettes, because that's what they've always done to handle stress. Or they can just play a lot of video games, that type of thing. That would be a poor choice. Better choice is say, look, I didn't ask for it. I've got this time on my hands now I hadn't asked for. Let's find out what I can do with it. So if you've ever thought about, or maybe even dreamed about the possibility of writing a book, get down, start writing the book. If you've ever dreamt about maybe becoming proficient in a new language, that would be the opportunity to get stuck in, learn a new language. Or for me, I read 4 books a month. I've been doing it for many months, and it keeps me on top of my game in a number of different fields, financial and those sorts of areas as well, apart from work. And I do that to keep myself fully focused, things like that, because I realize the danger of just having too much time and getting too lazy in that. So that would be the challenge. What can they put their energy into that would give them a sense of purpose now they have the time available? Because I remember a case where I was working with a woman from one of the states in the United States. When she flew into state to take class from me, she had the highest homocysteine levels they'd ever recorded in her particular state. She was described as a heart attack waiting to happen. Now, you're familiar with social readjustment rating scale? This was by Thomas Holmes and Rahe back in 1967, where they said 100 the death of spouse, that type of thing.
Yep.
Only the researchers at that time were saying, well, if you had 300 life change units over a period of 1 year, then there's about 90% chance of becoming ill. That's 300. Now, her score was 1,800, by far the highest I've ever seen. So when I had her in class, I realized, hey, if I don't do something about this to help bring that stress level down, she might not even get on the plane to fly back home. So at no cost to her, I worked on her a couple of evenings to bring that stress load that she was carrying down as low as possible. Now, then she got so impressed, she started inviting me back to her state, and I started teaching classes there. And I realized that a lot of things going on in her life were not under her control. And I won't mention them because she had high prominence in that particular state. things certainly not under her control. Now, if she focuses too much energy on things that she has no control over, she's just going to get angry, frustrated, lots of negative emotions, which will make her immune system go down. She'll be more vulnerable. She'll become ill quite easily. So forgetting about that, we decided, okay, let's focus on areas where you can exert some power, some control. And so she became a touch health instructor. She became a brain gym instructor, set up her own business. And once she had her own business going, then she could merrily go ahead there, help people in the local community, be an asset to the entire state, and maintain these other things over a period of years, just work their way through the system. But what we did is got to focus on areas where she could exert some control while focusing on areas where she had no control. That makes sense?
It does, and I love
laid
that.
Off, yeah, you can't afford to focus in on what's not happening in your life. You have to start redirecting your energy and make things happen in another area to get a sense of purpose, mission, drive, that type of thing.
So what I was saying is that it's such a proactive response, what you're talking about there, right? Yeah. The big thing is to be proactive rather than reactive, and being proactive, taking that on, moving forward, rather than waiting for the next bad thing to happen to you, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people in life are reactive.
Yeah.
And particularly under the current circumstances.
Okay. So then how do you like to go about accessing and balancing the different energetic structures that are involved in the immune system?
Okay, so you're talking about a more kinesiological approach now.
Yeah,
okay,
practical stuff.
Most of my early training was not in Touch for Health. I became Touch for Health instructor in 1977. Back in the old days, we had a 2-day class and straight into instructor training. But I met John Barton soon after that and decided to take training from him because I was really impressed with the fact that he could have a muscle out of balance and he had about 14 different ways to balance it. A lot of work with the emotions and nutrition. I love that. So I started working with him, and biokinesiology is different from most other kinesiologies. Most kinesiologies are based on a 14 meridian model. The 12 meridians you have in the wheel, and we have in the Touch Health book, and that we have in the 5-element model, and the central governing. Why the central governing? Because they have their own acupuncture points. One runs up the front, one runs up the back. And so most acupuncturists, most people in kinesiology work with those. But there are the 8 extra meridians, which include the central governing, and another 6 that are actually set in, I believe, in the body before the others get established. Now, one of those is mobility yang, and that's associated with thymus. And when you look at the emotions that affect that, this is a researcher, John Barton, it's feeling life's difficult, feeling troubled, life's too hard, too much responsibility, neglected. Well, just look at all those emotions. Those are the emotions that are being triggered now. Neglected, these older people feeling neglected. They haven't seen the rest of their families sometimes for months. So they're feeling neglected, forgotten, and too much responsibility. The people in the healthcare system, feeling life's too hard, too much responsibility, those sorts of things. And so one of the things I would do is check the thymus reflex, which is up here bilaterally alongside just alongside the midline. Find that out of balance, find out the positive emotion they put in, and work with a positive emotion, negative emotion to balance out all the emotions so they end up with the thymus in balance. Now, the other thing is some people are being exposed to John Diamond's work, and they might say, well, John Diamond says that faith is the emotion that's associated with the thymus, not the emotions I just rattled off. I disagree, because John Diamond said faith balances out the thymus, which balances out the meridian system. But John Barton found that faith is associated with the heart chakra, which then controls the meridian system. So here you have John Diamond, John Barton, both pioneers in the field, both originators of BKs, behavioral kinesiology and biokinesiology, both agreeing that faith is a major emotion that controls the meridian system. Now, when you look at that faith, what's the negative opposite? Well, John Barton had unfaithful, and other options would be despair, hopeless, helpless, fear, those sorts of things. Well, guess what people experience a lot of these days? Hopelessness, fear, despair. I mean, and those can be pretty vulnerable. I mean, there's a difference between feeling depressed. If you're depressed, you could probably pick it up. You wouldn't have as much energy. You wouldn't be combing your hair, things like brushing your hair, things like that. But if you are experiencing despair, I might not recognize it because it's more like an internal shut-off within the system, that you've given up hope. And that goes back to, I was reading a book by, well, you're probably familiar with it, by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Jewish psychiatrist in the concentration camp, and as a psychiatrist, he had a wonderful, well, he didn't ask for it, but he had a wonderful opportunity to explore the psychology of what was going on. So here's someone that's apparently very strong, they're sick, go to bed, 3 days later they're dead. And yet here's a weak, vulnerable, puny little man, and yet he survives the experience. So as a psychiatrist, he's asking himself, what's the difference? One should have survived. He looks to be very strong. He did. The other one looked to be weak. He survived. Then he realized it had to do with control. And as soon as the person in their mind decide that there's nothing they can do to get out of this situation, that the situation is hopeless, it's almost like they gave up the will to live and went down the tubes very quickly in a crisis. So healthy, and yet 3 days later they're dead. That makes sense? Whereas the person that said, doesn't matter what the Nazi guards do to me, they cannot take away from me my ability to think and make my own choices. And even though there wasn't very much control in those circumstances, it was enough to allow a person like that to stay alive, where the other person, as soon as they let go of the fact that they did have some control and got into things like despair, they went down the tubes very quickly. And it's a little bit the same as if you get someone that's diagnosed with cancer and the doctor says, well, unfortunately it's terminal, even though they've been healthy, apparently healthy up until just days before, as soon as they're told they're terminal, oftentimes within days, they can be dead. I've observed that over the years, and I realized, as soon as they're told by the authority figure that the situation is hopeless, they go into that despair, give up, and the system can shut down quite quickly. So that's why those emotions of despair, feeling hopeless and powerless about things are pretty traumatizing type emotions. And what I'm looking for when I work with my clients is evidence of those so we can eliminate them and give them an action plan to head them off in other directions into areas where they can start experiencing some hope and look forward to a positive future, because that's what Viktor Frankl found. Viktor Frankl developed logotherapy, and with logotherapy said what people need is a purpose for living. And we talked about purpose, that's for the old folks, watering the plants. That was their purpose that gave them something to live for. And people need to have faith in the future. They need to be able to see a positive future. As soon as the future becomes black and that, people can shut down quite quickly.
So in order to balance those energetic structures effectively, what we want to do is be finding the negative emotions, diffusing those, replacing them with something positive, bringing in the goal setting, find the purpose, right? Okay. What about nutrition? Because we haven't gotten back around to nutrition yet. Thoughts about nutrition that we could be using to support our immune system?
Yes. Yeah, the interesting thing is, because most people know about vitamin C, because vitamin C is good for the immune system, and vitamin D, that's what you're hearing. And there have been lots of studies into, I shouldn't say lots because I don't know, but there are studies with coronavirus showing that people that take vitamin D are less susceptible to viruses in general and the coronavirus. Now, so if I'm working with a client, I can check if I want to find out where they might be deficient in vitamin D, I can circumlocalize the spleen organ reflex that we use in biokinesiology. And if that's unlocking, then one of the nutrients that can lock it is vitamin D. So that's one of my first evidences that they're actually deficient in vitamin D. And that's, in my case, I actually supplement with D3 because England isn't known for its sunshine. We're in the period of time where it's raining and dismal most of the time. And I'm also quite surprised because over in Spain, for example, when they first started trying to tackle this coronavirus situation, what they do, they stuck everyone inside and say, you have to stay inside, you can't go outside, because they're afraid if you're outside, you might spread the virus. Well, it would have been better to have the old folks sit outside in the sun, so they're actually creating vitamin D to help strengthen them. If you stick them inside, you get them away from the vitamin D that they need. And most of them are not going to be taking vitamin D as a supplement anyway. So that's one. Now, if I want to find out whether they're deficient in vitamin C, which is something else that's very important, then I'd check the thymus, because that's one of the major nutrients needed for the thymus, vitamin C. Also the adrenals. The adrenals need pantothenic acid and vitamin C, top two nutrients. And the adrenals are the major organs we need to have working for us to handle stress. So I'd check the adrenal reflexes and the thymus, and if they unlock, hold up vitamin C, and if that changes it, then that's telling me that the body apparently is deficient in vitamin C, and it would be good if they start having some more fruits and vegetables containing C and the C complex in their diet. Plus, vitamin C is also water soluble, so under stress you can deplete large amounts of vitamin C very quickly. What does coronavirus attack primarily? Respiratory system. In Touch for Health, what's the major nutrient needed for anterior serratus, deltoid, coraca brachialis? Vitamin C, because that helps detoxify the things in the air that we draw into the body, vitamin C and water. And so those would be two of the biggies, vitamin C and vitamin D, and I think everyone should be doing those. Zinc. Then you get into, there are lots of vegetables, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, garlic, lots of those things that are very rich in vitamin C. And we've got astragalus and echinacea. I take echinacea each night, for example, just as a boost for the immune system. And let's see what else. Mushrooms, peppers, sweet potatoes. Yeah, so there are lots of things that are very rich in C that can be added into the diet quite easily, but you're not hearing it over here because it's not part of the medical model. I mean, in Ireland, for example, people going through medical training have 6 hours of nutrition, and that's taught by a rep from a pharmaceutical industry. So, you know, they're not getting any valid nutrition that's of any worth. And so what we're seeing over here is a medical response to coronavirus. A more holistic approach would be radically different, but it's not available. It's not being allowed.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing is that to use nutrition to boost immune system requires high compliance, right? Like people have to actually go and do that. And it's much more difficult to make people go eat well and then to double check that they did in fact eat well than it is to say, well, take this vaccine. We can see that you did it. We can prove that you've had it, right? I think it's difficult.
The interesting thing is, in terms of compliance, they had a study where they got the medical doctors to give a certain number of tablets, and they said you had to take one a day for 7 days. And if you have any questions, anything that's not working out, make sure you contact the receptionist. And they gave each one of them 6 only, not 7. So none of them can comply totally. Not a single one of them contact the receptionist to say that they were shortchanged. So that is it. Even most people following the medical doctor's advice are not going to be following as faithfully as they could.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about a few different things here about having a purpose and finding control and being able to be connected, working with the negative emotions and letting those clear and bringing in the positive that we need, supporting thymus and heart chakra. What other things could we be doing? You know, we as practitioners for ourselves, for our families, what do we do to take care of ourselves right now?
Well, okay. One thing that I often use, because people that know me know that I like simple things. I found after decades in this field that some of the most powerful things are actually simplest. Now, there's always a tendency for people to dismiss simple. They think if it's too simple, the medical people would be using it. Well, that's because they don't understand the medical profession. And the other thing is, more complicated isn't always more superior. So what I'm about to tell you is very simple, but I can tell you it's incredibly effective. I use it a lot. This is the Pennebaker method. It was developed by James Pennebaker. He was a professor, psychologist down in Southern Methodist University in Texas. That was Texas. And he observed that certain of these young co-eds, for example, that maybe had been date raped, or there maybe had been some incest, or something had happened, something traumatic in their lives, and they hadn't trusted that they could go to psychologist, counselor, rabbi, minister, priest, or anyone to talk about the issue, which means they've stuffed it. And he's assuming that somehow the fact that they've had this terrible experience and stuffed it, which meant they haven't dealt with it, is somehow contributing to the fact that these are the ones that are always going to the infirmary, they're always sick. So he asked himself, how can I help people that are too afraid to talk about what they've gone through? Now, presumably, if they were Christian, they could pray to God. That's expression beyond self. They couldn't talk to anyone, but they could certainly write about it. So he came up with a method where you literally write about your experience with deepest thoughts and feelings as fast as possible for 20 minutes, and do that 4 days in a row. Don't worry about spelling. Don't worry about grammar. Don't let anyone else read it. But it has to be deepest thoughts, has to be deepest feelings. If you just do one or the other, it's probably not going to work. If you do that, sometimes first day, nothing much happens, but usually by the second day, you get a lot of anger or a lot of deep emotion that you put a lid on at a cost, because you use a lot of energy to keep a lid on that. And because you're using a lot of energy to keep a lid on it, that's less energy for the rest of the system to operate, which is why the immune system's been weaker for these people. But once they start working on it, up comes these unresolved emotions, and they don't even need to do stress release, don't even do anything about it. They've surfaced, and then they disappear. And by the end of 4 days, they work through those experiences, and then they normally come to an acceptance, clearer understanding of what was going on, a lot of times inner tranquility. And then the question becomes, was it effective? Yes, these people that were always sick, going to the infirmary all the time, are no longer they're no longer sick as much. In one study, they measured the T lymphocyte level as a measure for the strength of the immune system. And the T lymphocyte level was here, and then straight after the experience, 4 days, up it went, and several weeks later, the T lymphocyte level is still elevated. So we have lots of evidence that even though it's a very simple technique, it's very powerful. And I've used it, well, I'll just give you 2 experiences to show how powerful it can be. I worked with a woman once. She needed to be baptized in a particular church, but she was afraid of water. She wouldn't even, if her husband was out by the pool at a hotel, she couldn't even look out the window because she'd see the swimming pool, and that would freak her out. And there's reason for it, because when she was younger, 2 kids tried to drown her. So we know what the problem was. And so I did the fusing stuck emotions approach and got rid of that quite quickly, in a few minutes. But then I thought, just in case there's something else there, let's have her write about it using the Pennebaker technique, just to see if there's anything else there, because that'll allow it to come to the surface. And just as well we did, because guess what? Some other memories that she had, but she'd put a lid on, so she didn't have any conscious awareness of, came up to the surface. And consequently, she did that herself. And then a week later, she got baptized, dunked under water, no fear at all of water, totally gone. So there was a case where giving her that as an assignment after the work I'd done achieved greater results than if I hadn't thought to do that. Another of my friends was a top teacher in a large school of 2,000 kids, and she used to do kinesiology on some of them that were running into problems. She'd been there for decades at the school, and she got so busy, she couldn't do that anymore. So when people come in and talk about how traumatic their home lives were, she'd just give them the Pennebaker technique to do. They'd do that. She'd tell them to come back in 4 days' time. They'd come back, and they'd talk about how radically different they felt. So yes, very simple, very powerful. This could be taught to, we could do it as practitioners. You can do it over traumatic experiences you've experienced in the past, or if you're going through a prolonged stressful period, such as we have now with the pandemic, we could do it on an as required basis, writing about the current experiences going on in our lives as a way to get the stress out of the way. That makes sense?
And you usually do this as like a homework assignment after you've done a session on the issue as well?
Yes. In one case, I was working with a woman that, for example, I won't give the details, but in this case, she had cancer, had gone to remission, came back, and I found out details of the relationship with the husband. And basically, he was a jerk. He was, doing things that you shouldn't be doing to someone that you that you respect. And I said, well, how would a normal person feel under those circumstances? And she said, well, I guess angry. Do you feel any anger? No. So I gave the Pennebaker technique to deliberately bring the anger to the surface. And I was just about to fly off from America to Belgium a couple of days' time. So I phoned her up just to make sure she was following through. And I said, how are you doing? She said, really angry. And she shouted out, and we burst out laughing because it had done its job, you see. That the Pennebaker technique brought up all that anger that she'd put a lid on and wasn't even aware of. So yeah, I often use it to bring up emotion where it should be there, but it's not apparent.
Okay.
And that's simple enough. It can be explained to someone over the telephone. It can be used by old folks in old folks' home, even though they might write a little bit more slowly.
So the last question I usually ask people when we do this are, for those that are intrigued by something that you have said, because we have relatively short time to have these conversations, if somebody wanted to follow up on this and learn more, do you have ideas for resources that they could use?
Well, seeing we were talking about the Pennebaker technique, I'd say if people are interested by that one, there's a book by James Pennebaker. I'll just get the title exactly. Opening Up the Healing Power of Confiding in Others. Opening up the healing power of confiding in others. And what's good about here, you've got research studies from all over the world with lots of different university groups addressing single mums, people in institutions, old folks, medical students, all different segments of the population. They experimented with the amount of time, 3 days or 5 days, until finally they gelled down to 20 minutes, 4 days in a row. So I like that type of book because I can see the ongoing research and how the ideas developed, and you get ideas on application. So that's one I'd recommend. Another one that I haven't even referred to any time during this interview is one by Johann Hari, and Hari is spelled H-A-R-I. And the name of that book is Lost Connections, Why You're Depressed and How to Find Hope. Because he went the typical route. He was on medications to try to solve his anxiety and depression, finally realized it wasn't working. And as a journalist, went in and did some thorough research and found out that most depression and anxiety is not a medicinal drug deficiency at all, but due to loss of connection. And he talks about all the ways in which we lose connection as the cause of these emotional factors, and why that's important, because that's what's playing out now. We've got loss of connection. We've got the extended family is broken down. Grandparents can't mix with grandkids and that. And with that loss of connection, then you go into things like anxiety and particularly depression. So we've got Prince William, for example, saying, we've got a major mental health crisis on our hands now because of the COVID-19. So that's one I'd highly recommend. It's wealth of information for people that love reading. Yeah, okay. And the material, a lot of the others, I teach a class called Overcoming Adversity, so a lot of it's out there because I've read a lot about resiliency, overcoming adversity in general, and piled together a lot of the techniques that I find most useful that relate to the sort of things we've been discussing. And I've got a new book coming out next month. That'll be a lot of the techniques I've been using over the last few decades, and that with no muscle testing. Now, this was not designed for coronavirus conditions, as it turns out, but it's just ideal because people that are not in a position where they can be doing muscle testing, which should I read this book and turn around and apply these techniques to get more control over their lives, to get rid of emotional distress, things like that.
Well, that's exciting. I didn't know that. When is the book coming out?
Well, I'm still looking for a title right now, and then I need to get the cover design and get it formatted. So I've still got a few hurdles to jump through, but it's getting quite close.
Amazing.
By the end of next month, maybe.
Okay. Well, that's fantastic. We'll be waiting anxiously for that.
Right.
All right. Well, I just want to thank you so much for this, because for myself, I know that when all of this sort of started last year, I was watching, there seems to be a tendency, even among practitioners, to want to get in to start like formatting the virus and looking at the pathways and that sort of thing. And there's definitely power in that kind of information. But I found myself writing a lot about like as holistic health practitioners who believe in balancing the whole body and looking at the energetic flows, is this the approach we want to take? Or do we want to look at a much more holistic model, right? And what you're describing here is the holistic model. We're not fighting a virus. We are taking care of our body in a way that allows us to have love and connection and resilience.
Yeah, we're making the host stronger.
Yes.
So it's less susceptible.
Right.
But modern medicine's about destroying the invader. But that's not the problem. They've forgotten that there's a body that's been invaded, and if you make the body strong enough, then there's not a problem. So instead of wiping out mosquitoes, keep the water running. As long as the water's running and not stagnant, you won't have a problem with mosquitoes.
Right. Thank you so much, Wayne.
You're welcome, Alexis. Very good. And hopefully we'll meet again at a conference next year in Hungary.
Yes, definitely.
Flying around by then.